So our next guest is Joy Sanchez-Taylor. And we do have a book that we're going to be giving away, but we'll do that after this interview, or maybe after the third interview. We'll see. So Joyce is a college professor, if I'm not mistaken, and she, professor of English. She has written a book called Diverse Futures, and the subhead is Science Fiction and Authors of Color. So we wanted to have her on the show to talk about that, since the sci-fi and fantasy genres are really growing among African-American writers, especially young writers. So welcome, Dr. Joy, to Black Authors Matter TV.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Awesome.
Very well. I like your headset and the microphone there. It's really.
Oh, I'm just trying to keep all the ambient noise from my 5-year-old and my cat out. Thank you guys for having me.
So I get it, because they will meow just for no reason. So tell us a little bit about your background first in this whole category. What made you focus on science fiction, but just some of your background as a professor, or as further back, even as a reader.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, everything I researched started with my love of reading science fiction and fantasy. But I suspect, like a lot of people in your audience, I grew up reading predominantly white science fiction and fantasy authors, and never really thought about it. I just thought, oh, I'm the one weirdo Latina who happens to like a white genre, you know, because we're often taught that science fiction and fantasy are genres for white people or young white men. And then one day I picked up Junot Diaz's The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which is a book about a Dominican nerd who wants to be the next Dominican Tolkien. And I said to myself, oh my God, there's another nerd of color in the world. I didn't know that. I thought I was the only one. And that just made me want to go out. You know, the book, unfortunately, Diaz has been investigated for sexual harassment now, so I can't endorse his work too much. But he references Octavia Butler, Samuel Delany, and a lot of other science fiction authors of color. And that just made me want to go out and find those works and, you know, discover more sci-fi fantasy works that had, you know, people that looked like me in them. And, you know, everybody likes to see themselves depicted in books. You know, it's always fun, but it's even more important when those books are depicting the future, because everybody has a right to the future and everybody has a right to have, you know, imagination.
Absolutely.
So science fiction and fantasy are some of the most important genres needing to diversify today.
So now your book, is it kind of a yearbook, so to speak? There it is.
Okay.
Nice. Nice. But is it kind of a yearbook, so to speak, of different authors, science fiction authors?
Not exactly. When I was writing the book, I wanted it to be something that could interest anyone, a fan of science fiction, someone just getting into it. So what I decided to do was you know, in my research, I was going to conferences and I was seeing, you know, I would go to the Afrofuturism panel, you know, for Black science fiction. Then I would go to the Indigenous science fiction panel and then the Latinx science fiction panel. And I said, wait a minute, a lot of these people are saying the same things. Yeah, there's a lot of connections between authors of different races and ethnicities that are writing science fiction. So why don't I write a book that puts all of those voices together?
Yes.
And the way I organized it was around science fiction tropes. So there's a chapter on aliens and first encounters. There's a chapter on race and genetics, indigenous science and science fiction. So I organized the chapters in a way that they were thematic, so then I could talk about authors of multiple races and ethnicities in each chapter.
Okay. Yeah, you know, if you look at some of the older films that were science fiction, I used to always, well, it dawned on me just growing up watching some of it, or when when I got a little bit older, that the future never had Black people. And that
Yeah.
makes you wonder, okay, do we just like spontaneously combust or what happens? But the futuristic films didn't have Black people in it.
Yeah, a lot of media still doesn't. Um, yeah, I mean, I did not grow up watching science fiction and fantasy, not till I got much older. My parents weren't exposed to too much of it. I've heard from a lot of people how important seeing depictions of, actors of color on Star Trek was to them growing up, and different media sources like that. I know the impact of Black Panther, the movie. I mean, that was a cultural phenomenon, and it made me so happy to see groups of people getting together and going to see the movie and being excited about it.
Mhm.
And I think after that, it sort of showed, we something we had all already known, but it showed the people with money that, Black people and people of color like science fiction. They like fantasy. They want to, go to these cool worlds with advanced technology also. And we weren't getting the chance, really, every once in a while, or a lot of times as the aliens in the movie, like Zoe
Mhm.
Saldana has been, what, black, green and blue before she was her own skin color in
Good
a
point.
science fiction movie.
It's interesting that you say that because that was a criticism that a lot of people had toward Disney cartoons,
Hmm.
where characters of color weren't allowed to be themselves. The Princess and the Frog was a frog throughout
Mhm.
the entire movie, just about. And then there was I forgot the name of the movie, the Christmas
Soul.
movie. Yes, Soul, that was
Mhm.
another one. Where the characters of color were something else for
Mhm.
most of the movie. They weren't able to actually be themselves.
Yeah. Or animated animals, voiceover actors, right? Yeah,
Right.
we like the voices, but
Mhm.
media sometimes hesitates to put too many actors of color in any sort of film or TV show, but sci-fi fantasy especially, because there's still that stigma that it's a white genre and that if you have too many characters of color, people aren't going to come and see it. And to
Mhm.
those people, I'm like, Black Panther. Like, we already proved that that's not the case. And yet, when it comes to spending millions of dollars, media tends to be very behind in those views because they don't like to risk the money. Whereas there's plenty of wonderful authors out there doing Kickstarters and self-publishing, and
Yeah.
that's really driving forward a lot of the really cool, like, graphic novels that I've been seeing. If you join a Facebook group like the Black Science Fiction Society or something like that, you can really hear about those projects and the authors, and publishing companies like MV Media, which is a small publisher, doing really, really good work right now, getting author voices out there.
Right.
Now
Um,
we did, um,
oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, were you about to say something?
Well,
No.
I was just thinking that a lot of times the industry is behind. They don't lead, they follow. So normally someone has to show, or some people have to show that they can sell books in a genre that it will make money, and then they come and sign people. That's normally the way that
Yeah.
works. But they don't lead trends. They
Right.
follow the trend.
Yeah. You have to be, if you're a woman or a person of color, you have to be exceptional out the gate, or
Yes,
you're not getting noticed.
right. You
Hmm.
do.
Absolutely. Now, we had a question from one of our audience members, Benita. She wanted to know if your book is for middle school students.
Ooh. Um, I mean, I think a middle school student could read my book. It is an academic book. But the book does give a lot of really good suggestions in the chapters on all different kinds of writings, from novels to short stories. So anybody teaching could also take some of the short story recommendations that are in the book and use those in classes if you don't want to use like an academic book chapter. But I know that a lot of college classes are assigning chapters of the book.
Oh, that's probably a really interesting class.
Yeah. Now,
Luckily for me, yeah, I've got now there are more sci-fi classes in college than there used to be.
right. So do you teach sci-fi writing? What do you teach as far as English? What do you focus on?
Well, I work at LaGuardia Community College. So we're in New York and we're one of the City University of New York schools. We're actually one of the most diverse community colleges in the United States. So I'm really proud to teach there. I don't teach upper level literature courses, but I do teach writing 1, writing 2, Latino literature courses like that. So of course I sneak in my love for sci-fi fantasy into those courses. I'm allowed to do themes, whatever I want, as long as I teach them to write about literature. So very often I'll do a course called Aliens and Aliens. And it's science fiction and literature of immigration, because a lot of my students are first gen, second gen students.
Okay.
And they really enjoy it because they start out going, what? You're going to teach us science fiction? And then by the end of the semester, they said, I thought you were going to teach us science fiction. These are just stories about immigrants.
Well, that's a good thing when you can make a genre like that just feel normal every day.
Yeah, a lot of times there's a misconception that science fiction is all about the hard science and the technology and the shiny robots, but there's a lot of really great science fiction being written that has advanced technology, but also mixes it with some really cool cultural references and different settings. If people are interested in something like that, I would say like Tananarive
And then if you do, yes.
is somebody you need to know, like her
Mm.
African Immortals series. It's
Yes.
sci-fi fantasy horror mix. Keep you on the edge of your seat for 3 books, and it's got advanced technology, but also immortal Africans.
Yeah, her books are on my top 20 of all time. And I've read thousands of books, but she's been on the show a couple of times.
Oh, wow.
Mm,
Lucky.
You read my mind, because the next question I was going to ask was who are some authors who you would recommend, and then you went straight
yes.
for the
Yeah, I was going to ask that
It's
too. So
it's the most important part of my job. I mean, I wrote this book because I love these authors and I want people to know about them. So yes, Tananarive Due is on the top of my list, but also Octavia Butler was one of the originators. She's got her name on Mars. If you don't know her work, I highly recommend her last novel. Read that first, actually. It's a short novel called Fledgling, and it's about a young Black vampire, and it's really cool. It'll get people into Butler's work.
yeah, I read that one. It wasn't that thin. It was a hardcover. When I got it, it was a hardcover. I want to say 300 pages, unless they broke it up.
I don't know. I don't know exactly how many pages it is, but I'm reading like, 500-page fantasy books right now for my next
Yeah, well,
project. So it
okay,
feels
so
really
it's thinner than it's thinner than that. But yeah, that was her last book, and that was really good.
Yeah.
Also, they made her movie. I mean her book, the one. Shoot, I can't think of
Oh,
the name of it now. The one that's a Hulu series.
yes. Is that Kindred? Yes.
Yes, Kendra,
Yes.
where she went back and forth in time. They did a pretty good
Yeah.
job of depicting it. I read it so long ago before the series that I didn't remember some of the details, and I would have to go back and read it again. And that book isn't that thick. Kendra is not that thick.
No,
But
Kindred is also, it's the most common one of her books taught in African American literature classes. Because
oh,
it's more like historical fantasy
yes.
than sci-fi or fantasy, but her harder sci-fi work really deserves to get known too. She's got a series of books called the Xenogenesis series, which is they're fabulous. I tell my students, if you read Octavia Butler, you are going to be uncomfortable, but that's a good thing because her work is amazing. She really is a genius. And then Nnedi Okorafor too, a Nigerian American author, and her Akeda Witch series is amazing. It combines advanced technology, juju magic, and an African setting, and it's really fabulous work.
Hmm.
As you're talking, when you were talking about science fiction and kind of using history and combining it with science fiction, it made me think of The Water Dancer, which is actually fairly recent. But with I always say his name wrong, Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. I always say his
Ta-Nehisi
name wrong.
Coates.
He's from here in the Baltimore area, and
Mhm.
I would actually think of his book as a little bit on the science fiction side as well, because if you read the book, you'll see that there are certain parts of the book where they actually jump from time to time, from time
Mhm.
period to time period. So there's a little bit of science fiction in there too. So, but at the same time, it's a historical fiction book.
Yeah, back in the day when I was in school, that they wouldn't call that sci-fi. No, this is literary fiction. This is a neo-slave narrative, anything but sci-fi.
A
Right.
Because
neo-slave narrative. Wow, I've never heard that term.
there's
What does
any
that
term,
mean?
basically sort of the idea of like magical realism, but set in the period of slavery. It's, the idea that they were trying, they don't want to say science fiction because some people still feel that science fiction is not literary enough
And
for.
and it can be depending on the way it's written.
But Ta-Nehisi Coates, yeah, that is definitely literary fiction. That is
Yes.
also sci-fi fantasy, and yeah, I mean, I would say books like that are really great for getting the general public into the idea of reading something more fantastic. And then I would like them to go on and support, the sci-fi fantasy authors who are not quite as famous, who are trying to get their work out there. But yeah, he's an amazing writer, and, he knows his history for sure.
I will say, which I think is great, and because I've never really been a science fiction reader.
Hmm.
However, just in the last few years, we've met so many science fiction authors. It's like it's making a resurgence where more young African Americans are wanting to write science fiction now, and it's making me want to read it a little bit more. And they may not think of it as science fiction because most times when people hear science fiction, they think Star Wars or
Star Trek.
something like that, and they don't.
Mhm.
Or when they think of fantasy fiction, they think they have to have a background in science for it to make sense. But that's not always the case.
That absolutely is not the case anymore. There are plenty of wonderful anthologies of Afrofuturism, indigenous science fiction, Latinx science fiction out there. If people want to start, I would suggest an anthology, and then you get a lot of short stories, and you can sort of get the flavor of each of the authors and see which ones you like. But definitely, there's hard science fiction, but then there's also like more social science fiction where it's more about the relationships. So something like N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth series, which was huge, won the Hugo 3 years in a row. I mean, this is definitely a science fiction work, but it's set in a dystopic future where the Earth is angry at people. It's very much about the relationships between people and the relationships between people and the Earth, which is something that people are becoming more aware of, the need for now. So I think, a series like that, it'll break your heart from the beginning. Sorry for anybody who reads it after you leave this interview, but definitely it's not, the technical science fiction and aliens and robots that you might expect.
Right.
So is the supernatural subgenre, is that considered part of sci-fi fantasy, or is that separate?
So speculative fiction is the umbrella term, and it holds all of those like fantastic genres in it. So sci-fi, fantasy, horror,
Okay.
all of that is going to fall under that umbrella. And a lot of the authors that I write about jump between genres under the umbrella of spec fic. And some of them combine them, like, Tananarive is, the best at combining sci-fi, fantasy, and horror all at the same time.
Yeah.
And it used to be they were punished for that. A lot of these authors do talks about having a hard time breaking into the industry because, they were not so friendly to authors of color just a couple of decades ago. And now it's a little bit more expected, although I think publishing companies are still trying to keep authors like in one lane. But thank goodness the authors are saying no. And, I know so many authors that will write a sci-fi series and then turn around and write a fantasy series. So Butler, Okorafor, all the authors actually that I mentioned do that, jump between genres. And now Dew is writing more horror than she's writing sci-fi or fantasy. So, I like it. I think the more genres, the merrier. I want to see fairies in space. I just think it's a cool idea. So go for it, give us something we haven't seen before. And I think these authors are just the best at doing that because, they're not used to thinking in that box.
Right.
They've had to push out of so many boxes in their lives that now they're like, whatever, I'm going to have fun and do what I want. And I
Well,
think they're just amazing.
it takes a tremendous imagination too.
Yeah.
To come up with all these different worlds and the characters within the worlds and how nature functions or technology functions. There are a lot of different variables to the book that actually become characters.
Mhm. And
And
a lot of authors bring their own cultural stories in. So Okorafor is big on that. She brings her family history, Nigerian cultural practices. Some authors are bringing in like Orisha deities, like Children of Blood and Bone was a huge series, and that's based on Orisha magic.
I was surprised with that story. Because I wasn't sure what to expect. I just said I bought the audiobook. And I really wasn't sure that it was more science fiction than I thought it would be, or more speculative maybe than I thought it would be. And as I'm just thinking it was going to be a nice African story. I did not realize that it would have as many layers as it did. But I really enjoyed it. And then I found out that the book wasn't even written for adults. It was more like a young adult type story, I thought. But
Oh, interesting.
I thought I had read that somewhere. I could be wrong, but I thought I had seen that it was kind of a young adult fiction, and I really enjoyed it. I'm like, I want to read the next one.
I mean, I think it was definitely marketed as young adult. It was on the young adult New York Times bestseller list for like 20 something weeks or something like that. But I also think a lot of female spec fic authors, even when they write characters that are older than teenage age, because I think Sally might be a teenager, but a lot of the other novels that I know from female spec fic authors, especially fantasy, when they're in their 20s and beyond, they'll still market them as YA,
Yeah.
which, is kind of strange, but, it's a hot market right now. So I think that people are really pushing for that and pushing authors of color to write speculative fiction for younger audiences. I think that's great because it reaches, readers at a younger age, but then I'm also a little irritated because I'm like, I want something for me. But the YA, I mean, a lot of YA has come
Yes.
so far.
yes, yes.
It's not just like, longing glances anymore. Like they really get into it, like brutality and police violence and, racism and everything in these YA novels. And I think that's great because I think the young readers can take it, and I think older readers want to read it too.
That's good. So, how do you see in the last couple of minutes that we have the next few years transpiring in this genre space, especially with authors of color?
I think authors of color who are writing speculative fiction need their fan bases. They
Yes.
need support because unfortunately they sometimes are breaking into the mainstream, like Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone. But for every one author there is like Adeyemi, there's so many other authors that are not being, that are writing in fantastic work and are not being recognized the way that they need to be. So I would definitely suggest that, anybody who wants to be a fan of sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and wants more diversity in those genres, join a social media group, around that topic. Look at the anthologies, look at the Hugo Awards, bestseller, the Hugo Awards every year. Some Not a lot of diversity in the awards still, but there are some authors of color getting on those lists. And now there are actually lists on websites like Tor.com, and specific authors will tweet or put up on Facebook their lists of their recommendations. It's actually Black Speculative Fiction Month.
Oh,
And
okay.
I know that because the publishers who publish Black speculative fiction are telling me on social media that that's October. So definitely go and support, the State of Black Science Fiction on Facebook. MV Media is another really big small publisher that publishes speculative fiction by authors of color. And then there are so many Kickstarter campaigns that need support as well. There's one in particular right now that I just supported, an author called ZZ Claiborne, who just wrote a Black Witch series that I really want to read. So I backed it. But these authors, they can only do so much with the Kickstarters. They really do need to break into mainstream publishing in order to be able to make enough money to live. So if we want these authors to be able to, stop working full time and write, we need to support them.
And that is the conundrum. We've got to get people to support all of our authors.
Mhm.
We can't just support the ones who are on the New York Times bestseller list.
Right, right.
Exactly. And going on social media, as much as I don't like social media for some things, it is great for connecting with other people who are interested in spec fic by authors of color and getting those recommendations, basically word of mouth, but online.
Right, right. Well, show people the cover of your book again so they can diverse futures. And
the artwork, I'm very glad I went with Ohio State because they commissioned the graphic novel duo Black Kirby, who they do a lot of great graphic novels. And yeah, I was very happy with the cover.
okay, well, thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much, Dr. Joy, for being on
Oh,
Black Authors Matter TV.
thank you guys so much
And
for having me.
and continue success with your book and making people aware of science fiction, fantasy, and authors of color.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you guys for the good work that you're doing. This is amazing. I've really had so much fun. I could talk for like another hour, but I'll go.
Okay, well, have a great evening. Thank you. And we'll be on the lookout for any other work that you put out.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.